Modern Horizons brought a surprising amount of tools to Modern, and while many other decks saw massive power spikes, Slivers did not go without a good amount of love. Since then, I've seen a few deck lists that have caught my eye, two of which I'll be covering in this video. The first is the classic Slivers build, the modern 5-color Slivers we all know and love. The deck utilizes both Cocos and Vials and was greatly improved with the printing of both Dregscape Sliver and Cloud Shredder Sliver. The second is an interactive, poisonous, and competitive build coming to us from Luke at Good Grief Games. The deck's heavy lean into blue means we're able to utilize Force of Negation very well, and a playset of Virulent Slivers means poison becomes a surprisingly potent and fast win condition. You can jump to any specific deck using the timestamps seen on the screen, and all deck lists will be in the description below for reference. Let's start off with my current 5-color Slivers build, based largely on my previous Modern Slivers video from earlier this year. If you haven't already seen that one, I'll have a link in the description below for it. The benefit of running all 5 colors is we have access to every possible sliver and the myriad of abilities that they bring. The downside is, even though you want to see all of these abilities on the board, not all of them will stack with each other, which is why I believe Collected Company becomes necessary. Coco counts as 2 slivers in 1 card, allowing us to run less copies of non-stacking utility slivers and more of the slivers we want to see in multiples. Pair Coco with Aether Vial and our board will become flooded with slivers surprisingly quickly. With the only 2 non-creature spells out of the way, let's talk about the necessary slivers you'll need first. To start, you'll want a playset of Sinew and Predatory Sliver. Both are effectively a 2/2 for 2 thanks to their abilities affecting themselves, and they pump your other slivers as well. The third lord is Sedge Sliver, and one that has a surprising amount of slivers players torn on whether or not it should be run. The huge upside is, if you have a swamp in play, it counts as a third lord, and additionally, it gives all of your slivers the ability to regenerate regardless of whether or not you have a swamp, which can come in clutch during combat, surviving bolts, pushes, board wipes, the list goes on. The downside is, you usually need a swamp, and with many dual-colored slivers becoming popular to run these days, like Cloud Shredder or Unsettled Mariner, finding ways to fit swamps into your list can become problematic. I'll cover the land base later in the video, but if you're at all worried, I've found Leeching Sliver can work as a suitable replacement. Leeching Sliver makes your opponent take 1 damage for each sliver that is attacking, which functions as a lord in most situations, as you'll probably be flying over your opponent's board anyways. And speaking of flying, Gale Rider and Cloud Shredder Sliver are both necessary slivers. Gale Rider you will want as a playset. Now, even though flying doesn't stack in multiples, hitting that evasion on a 1-drop is far too good to pass up. Cloud Shredder brings flying as well, but I like to view that as just some added bonus to an already upgraded Blur Sliver, which was our previous Haste Sliver. It's also worth keeping in mind that multiple instances of flying aren't such a bad thing in a very removal-heavy meta. Before Cloud Shredder was printed, I ran into multiple instances where I would intend to swing over my opponent's board with flying, only for Gale Rider to be hit with a Path to Exile and my slivers be dropped right to the ground. With both of these in play, chances are you'll still fly in over your opponent's head unless they're sitting on 2 removal spells and some decent blockers. Gemhide and Diffusion Sliver are the last 2 before we dive into the flex slots. You're running 5 colors, so having all of your slivers tap for mana becomes a crucial ability you'll want to see in many cases. If you're running a copy of Sedge Sliver, each sliver now can tap and regenerate themselves, which can seriously come in handy against board wipes and bolts. Diffusion Sliver has been an absolutely necessary sliver as well, and one I want to take a moment to talk about in a bit more depth thanks to Modern Horizons. Once Unsettled Mariner was printed, I saw a lot of Slivers players, as many as there are, begin arguing over whether or not it was better than Diffusion. On paper, and based on abilities alone, Diffusion takes the cake by far. Setting your opponent back 2 mana instead of 1 can be the extra turn that you needed to set up. But unfortunately, it's only a 1/1, which means the newly printed Wrenn and 6, as well as Plague Engineer, are going to be giving you a difficult time. I've seen some swear by diffusion, others only run Mariners, and a few run it as a 2-2 split. This will largely depend on your local meta, but make sure you pick up what you feel is right. Sometimes you need more protection, other times a 2-2 body can be much more useful. Assuming you're running a playset of each sliver I've already covered, as well as 20 lands, that gives us 4 additional slots to work with. Like I mentioned before, there are so many slivers for us to use here as we have 5 colors to grab from. But personally, I recommend 2 copies of Dregscape Sliver and 2 copies of Necrotic. Dregscape has incredible potential against any deck that isn't running Path to Exile as their removal spell. Whether your sliver gets pushed, bolted, or dismembered, you're still able to bring it back for a turn and swing out with it. Best part of all, a sliver is in your graveyard because your opponent didn't want you to have that ability, and being able to bring it back for just 1 turn might be your ticket to win. I made an entire video talking about Dregscape Sliver alone, which I'll link in the description below, as he has some incredible synergies with a surprising amount of slivers, and that includes Necrotic Sliver. First off, Necrotic Sliver is incredibly strong on its own, albeit a bit slow. Being able to destroy any permanent is always a nice option to have on hand, and yes, that does include lands. Viling in a Necrotic to blow something up will always catch your opponent off guard, and keeping an opponent off of Tron by blowing up their lands just feels great. Even better, it synergizes incredibly well with Dregscape Sliver. As long as Dregscape is on the board, you can sack your Necrotic Sliver to blow up a land, then on the next turn bring him back to destroy a land again. The mana cost can definitely be a bit pricey, but remember, your mana weft sliver means all of your other slivers can tap for mana as well, including the Necrotic that you're sacrificing. Please keep in mind these flex slots are far from set in stone, as other contenders like Dismember, Darkheart, and Frenetic Sliver are incredibly synergistic contenders as well. As for the land base, this will entirely depend on whether or not you're running Sedge Sliver. If you're not running Sedge Sliver, expect a standard rainbow land base similar to what you'd see in humans. If you are running Sedge, expect to need a land base similar to the one that you'll see on screen. Finding your swamps becomes necessary, so expect fetches and shocks to be hurting you a little bit, but that's just the price you pay for a Lord and regeneration in one sliver. Unfortunately, the newer dual-colored slivers make the mana base even trickier than it was before Modern Horizons, so be sure to get some reps in with this deck. Now, we've already gone over the pros of the deck, but after years of playing it, I think the cons need addressing as well. First off, removal should be an obvious weakness, as any creature-based deck hates seeing removal on the other side of the table. However, unlike humans, slivers suffer much more from losing a sliver. If Champion of the Parish is a 3/3 and another human dies, Champion of the Parish is still a 3/3. If a sliver is a 3/3 and one of your lords dies, that creature is now only a 2/2. This is to be expected with typical lords, however the current meta has given slivers some even more difficult matchups. Thanks to Modern Horizons, Plague Engineer can make your life a living hell. As I mentioned before, Plague Engineer alone can make Unsettled Mariner a better pick over Diffusion Sliver. If you don't have any lords and your opponent plays Plague, you just lost all protection and chances are the rest of your board as well. Even if you did have a lord, one fatal push on that lord means your opponent just found a board wipe for 1 mana. Also, Wrenn and 6 is a notably difficult card to go up against simply because of the fact that a 2-mana Planeswalker can kill about half of your slivers with his minus ability. Now, in a more fair meta, I would still say that 5-color Coco slivers would be a very strong deck, and with the recent banning of Hogak and Faithless Looting, we might just end up with that. In the past, this deck has always caught people off guard, and the wide range of abilities that 5 colors brings means your deck will be both strong and flexible. Unfortunately, the most recent meta shows that sometimes the deck just doesn't have enough aggro to outspeed some decks, and not enough disruption to stay late against some others. Which is exactly why this new Slivers build from Good Grief Games caught my attention, as it seems to be the quick, concise, and interactive build that Slivers needed to stay alive in the previous meta. This deck focuses on evasion and protection to ensure that your opponents can't dismantle your board, and packs poison counters as a surprisingly potent win condition. A link to the original article and deck list will be in the description down below. So let's start off with the basics of the deck. Predatory and Sinew Sliver are both played as a playset of each. They're the 2-drop lords in Modern, and they deserve to be in just about every Slivers brew out there. Not much else is needed to be said about these two, so I'll just move on to the Gale Rider and Cloud Shredder Sliver that are in this deck as well. Great evasion and speed on some very potent 1 and 2-drop slivers, and they're both slivers I already sang my praises on. You'll want a playset of each of these again as they play into our more linear game plan that this deck wants to bring. Last of the expected picks is a playset of Aether Vials. You're running a creature deck, you probably want these. Now this is where the deck begins to differ from most other sliver builds. Earlier in the video, I was jumping between whether I wanted copies of Diffusion Sliver or Unsettled Mariner. With this deck, you won't need to choose as it runs a playset of both. Since this deck wants to run a much more straightforward game plan, you'll want to ensure said game plan isn't dismantled before it happens, and packing 8 slivers that grant stacking protection can do wonders in getting you there. Remember, each of these abilities stacks, which means a Diffusion Sliver plus a Mariner makes your opponent's Lightning Bolt cost 4 if they want to kill a sliver. That doesn't seem like a bad thing to me. You'll usually want to play these before any other sliver if you can, unless you know for a fact your opponent isn't running much creature removal. Now the next sliver is one that really seals the deal for me, as I think it's a sliver that's been slept on for some time now. Virulent Sliver is a 1/1 for 1 mana and gives all of your slivers Poisonous 1. Until this point, I have greatly misunderstood exactly what this sliver did, as I thought it gave your slivers essentially knockoff Infect. I thought it caused all damage to be dealt as a poison counter instead of combat damage and not in addition to. If Virulent Sliver does get removed halfway through the game, the combat damage you've done up to this point doesn't go to waste, and you've still been chipping away at your opponent's life total this entire time. It just happens to have the added benefit of taking your opponent out of the game by turn 3. So here's an example turn 3 hand, assuming your opponent has no interaction. All you need is to play Virulent turn 1, Cloud Shredder, and swing on turn 2 to get 2 poison counters on your opponent, and then another Virulent plus any sliver on turn 3 for the last 8 counters. And I think that's the real beauty behind Virulent Sliver. The ability stacks to deal double the poison each time a sliver gets through. And with 8 slivers that grant flying, chances are they're going to. Now hitting 2 Virulence is not always guaranteed, but that's the beauty of running Phantasmal Image as your last sliver. This is another main board pick I'm extremely impressed with, especially with how well it works with every other card in the deck. As I've already mentioned, you can copy a Virulent Sliver to double up on the poison counters, but that's far from the only potential target. Aside from your flyers, every other sliver in the deck has an ability that stacks. An extra Lord always feels good, and a second Diffusion Sliver can really limit your opponent's options. Granted, Image dies as soon as it's targeted, but it really forces your opponent's hand. The best part is vialing in a Phantasmal Image at instant speed for some real shenanigans. Chances are your vial will be sitting on 2 counters, as all of our main board slivers cost no more than 2 mana this time around, and a surprise sliver can really steal a win if your opponent never saw it coming. Let's say you're swinging over your opponent's board with only 1 flying sliver, and just before they declare blockers, they attempt to bolt your Gale Rider. Before your slivers run headfirst into a wall of beefy Tarmogoyfs, you can activate Vial, then copy your Gale Rider sliver before Lightning Bolt goes off to make sure your slivers stay airborne. With all of our creatures and vials out of the way, we have our final 4 slots dedicated to some non-creature spells that really seal the deal. Alongside Phantasmal Image, we also have Gale Rider, Diffusion, and Unsettled Mariner helping make up a large portion of blue on our color pie, making Force of Negation a surprisingly good main board addition. According to Luke's calculations, we have about an 88% chance of having another blue spell with Force of Negation in our opening hand, which seems pretty good in my book. Having the ability to counter non-creature spells on our opponent's turn can really help to ensure our game plan goes off without a hitch. Meanwhile, our last 2 slots are dedicated to Dismember, helping us to deal with most problem creatures in our own way. With our mana base, Dismember seems like an obvious choice. And speaking of mana base, you'll probably want one that looks similar to most modern human builds again. Caverns, hives, and territories are a must, and ancient ziggurats are rarely the wrong decision. Luke's build runs copies of both Fiery Islet and Horizon Canopy, both of which hit most of our colors while also granting card draw. Again, I'll have a link to the original article in the description below, and I highly recommend that you give it a read. The write-up gives some great insight on both mainboard decisions and individual interactions, as well as some great play tips, so please check it out. Now, I didn't touch on the sideboard for either deck yet, but that's because they'll largely function similar to one another. And even then, I don't want to give a concrete sideboard list as it can largely depend on your local meta, plus the meta is about to change fairly drastically in the near future. For your non-creature spells, Chalice of the Void, Damping Sphere, and Relics are always some great go-to picks. Dismember is also never a bad choice, and for the second deck list, 2 more Force of Negations can really help you out in certain matchups. As for your creatures, Harmonic Sliver is a must, and you have to have at least 2 of these things in the sideboard. Otherwise, some more Dregscape Slivers can always keep you in the fight, and Darkheart can do wonders against Burn and other aggro decks. Frenetic can help you dodge board wipes, and can let you keep a reanimated Sliver from Dregscape if you're lucky. Venom Sliver can really win out creature matchups, and Hive Lord can be a straight up win if you manage to get it out. Even with all of these slivers in mind, I've only touched on a very small portion of the potential sideboard slivers, and that's part of the fun. Using some of your favorite slivers in the sideboard can just have some incredible answers that your opponent won't see coming. If you could click that subscribe button below, I would be extremely thankful. I'll be sure to have a link to all deck lists in the description below, as well as my previous videos I've made on Modern Slivers already. My previous Modern Slivers vid has even more tips and tricks when using the tribe, and my Dregscape video goes into much more detail on how well Dregscape interacts with many other abilities. A huge thank you to Good Grief Games for letting me feature their new take on Modern Slivers, and another huge thanks to Oatmellow for allowing me to use their music throughout this video once again. Links to both of their sites will be down below, so please click those links and give them some love. And as always, thank you for watching, and I still have no idea how to end a video.